We're glad you're here tonight, and we'd remind you of the question period in about 30 minutes. So if we come across some ideas that you hadn't thought about or you have more questions about, might make some notes and be ready. We're talking about the fossil record this evening, and this is one of my favorite subjects. I do find that Christians are often intimidated by the fossils, convinced that this belongs to the evolutionist and that we need to stay away from that kind of thing. Well, I think just the opposite is true. This is positive evidence for the record that we see in Scripture. Often we're criticized, I think unfairly, but we hear the criticism that you only have negative evidence against evolution. Well, this will be positive evidence for the account that we find in Scripture. Notice the role that fossils play in the thinking of the evolutionist as described by S.M. Stanley of Johns Hopkins. He says it's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. I think he's right. And I think they do have the absence of fossils in terms of evidence for their position. And I would ask you to remember that as we conclude this evening. That's his analysis if he doesn't have the evidence from the fossils. He says the fossil record, and only the fossil record, provides direct evidence of the major sequential changes in the Earth's biota. So this is where it's at. If there's going to be proof for evolution, it would have to be with the fossils. Well, how are we able to look at the fossils and distinguish between creation and evolution? What would we see that would indicate one or the other? I think predictions are one of the best ways to compare models. If this model is true, then we ought to see this. Or if that model is true, we ought to see that. And I think there are very obvious contrasting predictions about what we should see in the fossil record with creation and evolution. The beginning would be the most critical part, the most dramatic and obvious part in terms of the two different ideas of origins. The evolutionist predicts that there would be a simple, gradual, linked beginning, but start with virtually nothing and then gradually get more and more complex. Whereas the creationist says, nope, it should be complex and abrupt, separate, diverse, right from the start. And that is dramatically different. As you proceed up the column, we would expect to see, as an evolutionist, an allied kinship, a continuum, a progression upward that's connected. Whereas the creationist says, no, it should be separate and distinct, and that what we should see is stasis. That's a fancy geologic term that means it stays the same. We get status quo from it, a Latin term that means it just the opposite of evolution, basically. We'll talk more about that later. We would also both expect to see similarities in the fossil record, one due to common designer, the other due to common genetic origin, but they would be different. We could distinguish between the similarities that would be produced by those two causes. The similarities for evolution would be this branching pattern, like the series of nested tables, developing upward, whereas the design of the creation would indicate a designer use a blue tile here where he needs it, a blue tile over there because that's where it's needed, but not necessarily connected. And so we could see a mosaic pattern rather than the branching pattern. In each case, we see that which can be distinguished. It's different. If we see this model wins, if you want to put it in competition terms. If you see that, the other one wins. Well, we look at the fossil record, and I can tell you there's an abrupt, complex beginning, and it's separate and distinct, and stasis is the order. But then a lot of people wouldn't be impressed with that because creationists are prejudiced, you know. and judging our motives, they'd say that's not really objective. And so we'll use the conclusions, the descriptions of the evolutionists themselves, the testimony of an antagonistic witness. And that's a concept that sometimes is misunderstood. And people will say, well, no, that's not fair. They don't agree with you, and you're quoting them. That's taking their words out of context. No, that's not taking them, we shouldn't take them out of context. We should represent them correctly. And that's why we have the handouts, so that you can see the context and that you can go back and look up the full reference. But when an antagonistic witness testifies contrary to his interest, then that really helps more than the friendly witness. You have a friendly witness who says the accused is honest, there's no reasonable motive, that will help. But that's your friend, and you expect them to be helpful. And so that doesn't count nearly as much as the testimony from the antagonistic witness, whose testimony is considered 10 times weightier, the general rule, in court, if you can get the opposition to admit the point. So the friendly witness testimony, that's good, but nothing like the acknowledgments from that which is contrary to their interest, which is what we'll be using. And so I want you to understand, and this is one of the points, these men are devout evolutionists. They are believers, but they're believers in evolution. They are truly men of great faith in evolution. I think that'll be obvious. We'll begin with Richard Dawkins, who certainly qualifies, sometimes called the Pope of Evolution, from Cambridge and also Oxford. And he's talking about the beginning of the fossil record that we described last evening. What's the nature? We've got different predictions about what ought to be there, but here's what he acknowledges. We find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. Now, you think about that a minute. How does he know it's a state of evolution if, boom, that's advanced right from the start? It's as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Well, how do you know it's an evolutionary planting if there's no evolutionary history? That's just a matter of faith. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationist, and I'll plead guilty. That's exactly what we predict, and that's what we see according to the antagonistic witness. He's acknowledging that, not us. We see representations of the beginning of the record like this from very antagonistic publications like National Geographic. The beginning of the Cambrian period, that bottom layer, is an explosion of life. Now, that's not a simple beginning that gradually works upward. Stephen Gould, one of the more famous evolutionists in the world, best known from Harvard, recently deceased, says the Cambridge explosion occurred in a geological moment. Now, that's the way he describes the beginning. The Cambrian is that bottom layer, occurred at a geological moment. We have reason to think all major anatomical designs have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. He reminds us it's an evolutionary appearance. But boom, it starts with nothing, and then at the beginning you have an explosion. You have all the major anatomical designs right from the start. That doesn't sound like an evolutionary appearance to me. He just names it that out of faith. He says not only the phylum Chordata, now that's the biological group that involves backbones. We would belong to that category. Generally the highest order. Not only that highest order, but also all of its major divisions right at the start. Now you look at the trees of evolution, and that's what they put up at the top, and all the divisions. No, that's what you find at the bottom, which is upside down. Contrary, he acknowledges, to Darwin's we'd say predictions, expectation. Here's what they predict, and it's not what they predict. It's obviously very different. It gets worse as far as they're concerned. Since the so-called Cambrian explosion, Gould says, no new phyla of animals have entered the fossil record. So boom, there it is, all the major divisions of the highest orders right at the start, and no new ones since. What does that sound like to you? Creation or evolution? I think it's the bottom of a flood deposit, but it certainly is not a gradual evolutionary development. Maxwell Maltz, the University of Texas, says the Cambrian explosion, it was not a gradual development of complexity. Well, now that's what Darwin predicted, and that's what the evolutionist expects. These things suddenly seem to burst out of a magic box. Now, creationists didn't write that. You might think so, but these are the words of the antagonistic witness. And of course, that was a few years ago. We'll just bring it on up to date here to 2012 and then even further as we move along to the documentation. Evolutionary biology is telling us about the beginning fossils. The fossils from the Cambrian period can cause a real headache for evolutionary biologists. It's another way of saying it does not fit the predictions of the evolutionist. They expect simple organisms evolving over time to become increasingly more complex. Yep, that's the prediction. And they highly expect to find that. However, during the Cambrian period, there was an apparent explosion of different major groups of animals, all appearing simultaneously in the fossil record. Can you tell which model is winning here? Whose predictions are being met? Is there any way to avoid that conclusion? Well, how do you deal with that? What do you say? Here, this year, reported here in Live Science from other earlier that same year publication, 33 authors have come to, and they've teamed up trying to come up with an answer. And this is the latest edition of the answer to the Cambrian explosion. How in the world, all of the major divisions, boom, right at the start. How do you account for that? Published in the journal Progress in Biophysics, Molecular Biology, has a simple, if unusual, thesis. The Cambrian explosion was the direct result of, okay, you ready for this? An extraterrestrial virus that crashed to Earth in a meteor impact. Aliens did it. The virus, alien virus, came. And that's how you get your Cambrian. 33 of the leading influential authors in the world teamed up, and now then they've got the answer. I think it just says it tells us how bad they're hurting and how hard they're trying to find an answer. In the same article, they talk about the origin of octopuses. And this is a challenge because they have a complex nervous. In fact, they may, and some have described them as the most intelligent animal in the animal kingdom. And some of what they're doing is just unbelievable. They have camera-like eyes, a capacity for camouflage without precedent in their family tree. Just boom, there they are. How do you account for that? Well, the authors posit that fertilized octopus eggs crashed into the sea aboard an icy comet at the onset of the Cambrian explosion. Boom, they came from outer space. The aliens did it. I just sit back and grin. I say, this is the best they can do. It's obviously not science. Nobody's seen alien octopuses or viruses. But they're hurting to try to answer the obvious implications of the evidence. Allowing the evolutionists themselves to describe the beginning, it burst out of a magic box. We're talking about the beginning of the Cambrian period. They're complex, It's suddenly right at the start, according to leading evolutionists, a real headache for evolutionary biologists, advanced, just planted there without any evolutionary history. Gould says all the major anatomical designs, the chordata, all of its major divisions, and then worst of all, no new ones since the Cambrian period. And so faced with that, trying to explain that, they come up with alien viruses and octopuses. And none of this is from creationists. This is what the evolutionist is trying to do. And I just sit back and smile and say, we're having fun. Maybe it's what it looks like. Just follow the evidence. No, can't do that. We got to have aliens from outer space. I think it's just getting obviouser and obviouser. And I think that's obvious. But you look in the biology textbooks, and this is the representation that you see, beginning with the small, simple animals gradually working upward to the chordata and man up at the top, which is upside down virtually to what you find in the fossil record, which Gould acknowledges. He says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossil. This, you see it in the biology textbook, but it's not what the fossils say. And if we're going to talk about the fossils, you've got to go another direction. In fact, in his book, Wonderful Life, he points out that here's the prediction and has this cone gradually working upward. That's exactly what's predicted, but he says the reality is just the opposite. It's going downhill. We're losing kinds. He says they've turned the traditional interpretation on its head. They have inverted the cone. That is, the paleontologists, those who study the fossils. This is not what you see in the textbook, but that's still being presented. Well, where does this tree come from? Doesn't come from the fossils. Well, let's let them describe the source. See if this sounds familiar if you were here last night. We have arranged the groups in a traditional way, with the simplest forms first, the progressively more complex groups following. This particular arrangement is arbitrary. Of course, some do it this way and some that way, but generally you see that picture of evolution reflected because they arranged it that way, not because of what you find in the fossil record. Now, that's not an entirely fair representation because you go further on the page and you see another criteria, a basis, while he says exactly what I've quoted here, he continues to say things are alike because they are related. Now that's the assumption. The similarities are what allow them to arrange the tree in spite of the fossils. The less they look alike, the further removed they are from their common ancestor. Okay, Dr. Patton, cousins have some similarity. You can look at father and son and brother and sister and see similarities, yes. Sometimes you don't see that, but sometimes you do. And you look in the living world and we can't deny the similarity. Some people out here would have a little more difficulty than others denying the similarity. We won't get personal, but yes, there's some. Now, the dissimilarities are obvious, but the similarities, I think, are more obvious. The question, and this, by the way, is called homology, the fancy term they use for the argument from similarities. We ask the question, why? The evolutionist doesn't. He just knows it's all about common genetics. He doesn't ask any questions there. I think good scientists ask why questions. Why is it similar? And there is more than one possibility. You drive down the street in a subdivision with houses that look similar, and that's because they're all cousins, or because they had a common designer, a common architect. And we've got an architect over here that can tell you about that. That wasn't a variety of architects that did that. That was a common one. A common designer, common genetics are possible explanations when we look at the similarity in architecture in the living world. The pendactyl form of the vertebrate hand shows a similar architecture. And again, the evolutionist doesn't ask why. He just knows that this is because of common genetics. But I think we should think about why questions and see that common designer would work just as well as common genetics in explaining these origins. A designer would create similar forms for similar functions, as we see a composer using variations on a theme to make a beautiful composition designed. That fits either, until we start looking closer and we see the argument from genetics begins to erode rather dramatically. In fact, we can say that similarity is not from common genetics. When we look at embryology, we see that this hand, this similar form, comes from different parts of the embryo, not coming from common genetics. The newt hand comes from segments 2 through 5 in the embryo, the lizard from 6 through 9, and man 13 through 18. If they all were coming from common genetics, that wouldn't be the case, but it comes from different genetics. In fact, Sir Kevin De Beer, who at the time was president of the British Museum of Natural History, he's at Oxford, says the attempt to find homologous genes has been given up as hopeless. Similarity in outward form, but not similarity in genetics. That is not there, and they've tried hard to find it. It's hopeless, he says. That explanation doesn't work. The similarity is outward. It is not from genetics. So I think we have an advantage in our explanation of a common designer. But when we see similarities, again, evolutionists doesn't ask the question and makes outlandish claims about similarities. You've probably heard the claim that chimps and men, when you look at the genome, the genetics, are 99% the same. This is a statement by Richard Dawkins, the blind watchmaker. Chimpanzees and we share more than 99% of our genes. Is he ignorant, or is he just not telling the truth? I don't know. Maybe he should have learned better. We can document that easily from the literature. As early as 2007, we have an article that refers to that 1% similarity. He says that's a myth. That's the heading of the article. Studies are showing that humans and chimps are not as similar as many tend to believe. Chunks of missing DNA, extra genes, altered connections, the very structure of chromosomes confound any quantification of humanness versus chimpness. There's no way you can say it's 10%, 10, 12%. You can't quantify because it's not comparable. It's different. And as we have learned more here from Nature 2010, perhaps the most prestigious journal in the world, comparison now reveals they differ radically in sequence, structure, gene content. The chimpanzee genome is 10 to 15% longer. Do you think a scientist might miss that when he's saying it's 1% difference? 50% of the human genes were missing from the chimp. How do you miss that when you're comparing the two? 50% of the human genes are not in, but you're saying there's just 1% difference. Somebody's not telling the truth. 1/3 more gene categories, entirely different classes of genes, but only 1% difference. Well, we would expect similarities, but they don't tell the truth about similarities. And sometimes similarities don't say what they say it always says. We look at these two fish and they look similar. And if you agree, I caught you. because neither one of them are fish. They look like fish, but one is a reptile and one is a mammal. They both look like fish, but neither is. And so sometimes similarities are not, quote, related, not even close. When you look at the whole picture, you begin to see a very different conclusion. One of the most obvious demonstrations of that is when we compare chromosomes. And this used to be done, and still is in some of the textbooks, as an argument for evolution. And we're told, look, the number of chromosomes indicate this evolutionary progression, and we're up at the top at 46, and here's the fruit fly down at 8, penicillium at 2, and obviously we're at the top of the heap. That shows an evolutionary progression. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? And as long as you select which similarities to show and exclude the rest of the evidence, that looks pretty good. Until you get the rest of the picture, and then things are very different. Humans down at the bottom, and you don't have half the chromosomes of a turkey. And the fern's up at the top with 480. Well, with the rest of the information, that argument looks kind of silly, doesn't it? Just need a little more information, and the whole thing is different. They're selecting what they want you to see and ordering it as they want you to see it ordered, and hoping you don't look at the rest of the picture. When we look at the rest of the picture in terms of men's relatives, and we're talking here about similarities, which we have to do if we're talking about fossils, because apart from that principle, you just got dead things and rocks. How do you know what they mean in terms of evolution? Well, this is similar, and so they line it up with this tree. But they don't play fair, and they just pick the similarities they want you to see and ignore the rest of the picture. We're often referred to the similarity of blood serum between humans and chimpanzees, and it is very similar. In fact, if the right anti-serum is used, you can actually utilize chimpanzee blood serum, and this looks like a pretty good argument, maybe. But we look at the rest of the factors, and in terms of milk chemistry, for example, the chimpanzee milk is not even close, and there are many others in the animal kingdom that are much closer, and it appears that the best, I'm not kidding, the cockroach. Here's from Science News 2016, got milk, roach milk could be a new superfood. Cockroach milk is among the most nutritious substances on earth, 3 times richer in calories than buffalo milk, the previous contender for the most protein and calorie-rich milk. So here is the leading contender for milk chemistry, certainly not the chimpanzee. In terms of cholesterol, which a lot of us are interested in today, the closest relative is the garter snake. Well, I know some people that might fit that picture, but that's not what they're putting in the textbook. They haven't selected that similarity. We're interested in teeth often when we're looking at fossil men. That's what survives better than anything else. And often arguments are based on one tooth or just a few teeth. But the closest relative in the animal kingdom is not the ape or the chimpanzee. When you look at teeth, what do you think the closest would be? It's fish. Now that's not photoshopped. You don't need to get envious about this, but there's a pretty good set of teeth there. You look at the apes, and yeah, they're similar, but you can sure tell the difference. But the sheep's head fish has some great teeth that looks a whole lot like ours and a lot more similar than the apes. But see, he's not in the lineage leads to man. They don't tell you about that. They just leave out the whole picture. And even the parrotfish has got a pretty good set of choppers there compared to the apes. Fish is the closest. Foot structure is something we're interested in when we were looking down at Glen Rose at the footprints along with the dinosaurs. And sometimes people will say, well, maybe it was made by an ape, which wouldn't help the evolutionary problem because they're supposed to have evolved about the same time humans did and about the same separation between them and the dinosaurs, according to the evolutionists. But the ape doesn't have a foot like ours. He has a hand for a foot. The opposing toe wraps around branches, and I think it's designed for that. Certainly not like our feet. When you look at the glacial bear's foot, you see a dramatic similarity. He's got feet very similar. Now, it's a mirror image. His thumbs are on the other side. And of course, he has claws and is a quadruped. But if you look at the skeletal structure and remove the claws, boy, that is almost a dead ringer for the human foot, not like the ape. Tyrosine is a very complex chemical, and we need it in our eyes to fight bacteria. And the lysosome goes around like little Pac-Man eating bacteria, and that's good. We need that. The chicken needs that down where they're laying the eggs, and you got exactly the same lysosome, the very same chemical, very complex enzyme to fight bacteria, like the blue tile here and the blue tile there, where it's needed, but not this branching pattern, as would be indicated if we see it with apes and all the way through. Also, by the way, the nematodes have the same chemical. Blood antigen A, our closest relative is the butterbean. Blood antigen A just like ours in terms of brain hormone. Wow, that's pretty complex stuff. Here he comes again, the cockroach. In Discover magazine, we're told, don't squash that roach, he may be your cousin. The cockroach and man, it seems, share, not similar, a common brain hormone, which they've told you all about in the textbook. Now, when you look at the whole picture, you're seeing a mosaic pattern. The blue tile here, that's the way a designer does things, putting it where it's needed. With the evolutionist, he would expect similarities, but the branching connected pattern, which you can present if you only look at some of the similarities and exclude the rest of them, which you obviously have seen that they have done. The whole picture makes it look very, very different. Now let's move quickly to transitional forms, which is what we would have to see as we go up the column. Darwin commented on that, and many people think this is what convinced him. Innumerable transitional forms must have existed, but why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why is not every geological stratum formation full of such intermediate links? If everything got here by evolution, we ought to see things leading up to everything, but we don't. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such graduated organic chain. And this is perhaps the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. The fossil record didn't convince Darwin. It was the biggest problem he had, according to Darwin. But he made a prediction. Again, this is one of the ways you test the model. He predicted, yes, we do not see the filling in of the gaps. They're all separate. You don't see transitional forms. Well, that's because we haven't collected enough. And this is a poor record that we're looking at, and with further collecting, then that will all iron out. We'll see all of the gaps filled. Well, did that happen? We're 150 years later. We ought to be able to tell. Niles Eldridge is curator of the American Museum of Natural History. Over 32 million fossil specimens cataloged in this museum. Darwin didn't have anywhere near that. So now we've got a much more complete picture. And Niles Eldridge talks about that. He says Darwin, prophesied that future generations of paleontologists would fill in the gaps by a diligent search. That's the prediction of the model. He says it has become abundantly clear the fossil record will not confirm this part of Darwin's predictions. Fell flat on his face with the prediction. And that's the way you test the model. Nor is the problem a miserably poor record. The fossil record simply shows this prediction was wrong. Now, that's not Don Patton, creationist, saying that. That's Niles Eldridge, curator of the museum with 32 million fossil specimens in it. Derek Ager, when this comment was made, was president of the British Geological Association. In the proceedings of the Geological Association, says it must be significant that nearly all of the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked. And in Darwin's time, there were some stories told, and he calls them stories, but they are debunked stories. You've heard of the myth buster. Well, that's what he's describing here. He says, and here we're quoting from David Rapp, who is curator of the Chicago Field Museum, the largest fossil museum in the United States. Darwin was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted it would. In other words, his predictions were not met. Now we're 120 years after Darwin. The knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have over 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this, I mean some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the fossil horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. Now, you all know about the evolution of the horse from the textbooks, and you have seen that it's been discarded and had... No, you haven't seen that. We'll have to talk more about that in the second session. Let's take a break at this point, and we'll use that as an introduction to the next part. Who has a question? Yes, sir.
So if we're supposedly supposed to come from chimps, what would the evolutionist answer be to why there are still chimps today? If they're a lesser form of humans, why would they have not evolved with us?
Their response, and I'm not saying this is necessarily consistent, but what they would say is, no, we didn't come from apes. You're looking at modern apes. We didn't come from them. We both came from a common ancestor. And that's how we both got here. Now, the truth is they do say we came from apes. That's not an accurate representation, but that's the response. And that's fairly reasonable. Yes, sir.
I think I have a couple of questions, maybe try to ask them in the right order, so maybe one before the other. Toward the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned something that brought a question up for me. How are fossil ages classified? Is it sort of a combination of their geology and radiometric, or is it one or the other? How do they classify a fossil as belonging to a certain period?
It's almost never radiometric dating. It's the rock that it's found in, and then the rock that it's found in is determined by what fossils you find in it. So it's a circular process. And sometimes they'll be sure this rock is of this age until they find, ooh, I didn't know that was in there, and so now then the age has changed. It's a kind of a nebulous thing, but generally speaking, you see things that live at the bottom of the ocean first, and then things a little bit higher next. And there is that general order with some exceptions, but it's certainly not the ordered sequence that we see in the books.
So then, I guess, not really a follow-up, but you mentioned also toward the beginning that, I don't remember his first name, but Gould, there was the quote that you had that he said that there had been no new phyla since the Cambrian period.
Right.
Can you explain the implication of that? What exactly that means and the implication of that? I mean,
The phylum is...
really surprising.
Yeah, the phylum is the major division in biology, and you got them all, right, to start with. Now, sometimes they'll say almost all, and there may be some technical exceptions, it'd be hard to find. Others just say, yeah, they're all there, which would be emphasized then in the fact there've been no new ones since. So what we got is there. In fact, we had more then than we have now. It's gone downhill. So all the major divisions, which is what a phyla is of biology, were there, and there's no new major division since then. That just says it's not a picture of evolution.
Yeah, I'm just having a tough time wrapping my head around the fact who said that and
Yeah.
how.
Well, we actually had, I think, 3 people that we quoted here that
Yeah.
said that, and it's not that hard to document.
Yeah, all I mean is, how could he make that statement and then?
And be an evolutionist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. Man of great faith. It was an evolutionary appearance, and that's an evolutionary mystery. It's just everything evolutionary. Wave your hands and hope people don't notice the problem. I'm not really exaggerating. These are their descriptions, and not only do we have those quotes there in the handout that you can look up, but we've probably got several extra there that we didn't get to help reinforce that point. But that's a mind-blowing. You got them all at the start and no new one since, and try to say that's evolution? Wow, you just really... The response I heard recently, we were debating at Lamar University, or at least in a discussion with a bunch of geologists, and the head of the department said, well, Dr. Patton, see this book right here? It says the fossil record, and we open it up, and here's all the fossils. Now, every one of these got here by evolution, which means every one of these are transitional forms. Well, if you begin with the conclusion that they all got here by evolution, then, well, yeah, they're all transitional forms somehow. But it's not because you can show the similarity that where one leads to the other. It's because you have faith in evolution. Good questions. Yes?
What is the appeal of the alien argument? Why do you think that is now all of a sudden coming up as an explanation for the stars?
They got nothing else any better. It's kind of like asking why the stork stands on one leg. You know, if he lifted it up, he'd fall down. If he had something better, he would use it. Aliens, green men, I would be embarrassed, but they, and of course, logically, it doesn't answer anything. It's not even on the subject. We're talking about origins. Well, where did it come from? Outer space. Okay, how did it originate out there? It doesn't say anything about that. It's talking about directions, not origins. It came from over here. Where did that come from? Well, it came from over there. And you're not, in logic, that's called infinite regression. You just keep moving, kicking the can down the road. You're not answering anything about origins, which they can't talk about. So don't be fooled by, sounds like an important argument, transpermia, outer space. But they're not even on the subject, and they're talking about directions, not origins, and certainly not how things originated. And they do it because they don't have a better one. Other questions? All right, thank you for your interest. Let's take a quick 5-minute break, and then we've got some, I think, fun things to show you, and we'll do a little mucking around before we get through. We ended with David Rapp's statement updating us on the prediction of Darwin, who predicted the gaps would be filled in, but he says it's gotten worse. Some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil have to be upgraded, have to be discarded or modified, as a result of more detailed information. Particularly, he's talking about the horse here, and most of us have seen the evolution of the horse portrayed in the biology textbooks, and this looks like an evolutionary progression. However, it's different in other parts of the world. This is North America, as he pointed out. And when you add a 9-foot donkey, like we excavated over near Lubbock, Texas, that kind of messes up the chart, doesn't it? That's a little bit of the rest of the story. But you have big horses and little horses today that are pretty much what you see up and down this picture, with perhaps the exception of the first one, the Hydrocatherium, or Eohippus at the top, is controversial, and many would say it doesn't belong in the lineage anyway. This is a picture of the fossil that got it its name, and there have been many more detailed fossils found. It was named in 1840 by Richard Owen, who was a devout creationist and founder of the British Museum of Natural History. The word means like a hyrax. Doesn't mean like a horse. And he didn't think it looked anything like a horse or make any connection there, but like a hyrax, which is what it's still called. Now, when you update that to 2016 in the Oxford Museum, it says, here's the first horse, like a hyrax, which is what that word means. Wait a minute. How did it get to be the first horse if it's like a hyrax? The hyrax looks quite different from horses. Now, maybe you could put a saddle on him, but I don't think that looks like a horse, and others don't think it does either. If you look at Wikipedia, it says hyraxes are sometimes described as being the closest relative to the elephant. Although whether this is so is disputed, which I can understand. I don't think he looks much like an elephant. He looks like a hyrax. And that's what the name means, and I think that's what he is. The rest of it is big and small horses. Now, they will say, well, some of them have 3 toes and some of them have 1 toe, and you've got this order, except they're not in the order that they're often represented. In fact, in South America, they're in the reverse order, and A.S. Romer is probably the most revered paleontologist of all time from Harvard. South America, the 1-toed fossil is found below the 3-toed fossil. And in Nebraska, you've got all of them together, all of those except that one at the top, which I don't think belongs there at all. 2 of these specimens found at the Ashfall fossil beds in Nebraska have the 1 toe, and 3 of them have 3 toes, and they're all buried together in the same ashfall. Where's the evolution? They were just varieties of horses that used to live, and we've lost some of them. So what we see in the fossil record is good evidence for 3 kinds, the hyrax and the horse and the elephant. And putting them together is where the foolishness happens. But the idea of that's presented in the textbooks, I think is very deceitful. In fact, George Gaylord Simpson would agree with that. He is the one who came up with this diagram and the argument that's often used, and he has backed away from it. In his book, Life of the Past, he says, the uniform continuous transformation of Hydrocatherium into Equius, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. And so the leading expert, the one who came up with the argument, says, nope, that's not the way it happened. Now, he is a devout evolutionist, but what you see in the textbooks does not represent it. If you're talking about transitions from one to another, probably the one that comes up as often as any would be Archaeopteryx, which is supposed to be the perfect transition from the reptiles to the birds. He led to, and this is just a primitive bird that's just kind of halfway to a bird from a reptile. It has teeth, and that's proof that he's primitive. I don't agree with that. I've got teeth. And you see a wide variety of critters that have teeth and that don't have teeth in the living world. There's some birds today that have teeth and some don't, and there are some reptiles that have teeth and some don't, and some amphibians that have teeth and some don't, and probably some of you have teeth and some don't. What's the problem here? You lose your teeth, that's usually not a good sign. The tern in the fossil record almost always has teeth. That's a variety of tern that has teeth that is more common. They are powered flyers. They fly 3,000 miles a year in migration patterns, and then teeth don't hurt that at all, and some of them have teeth. Most of them do not have teeth today. They've lost it. You have beautiful feathers. They're asymmetrical, which indicates an airfoil, powered flyers. The wing looks like the wing of a powered flyer. But look, it has claws out on the end, and this is supposed to indicate that he's part reptile. But you've got birds today, like the Hoatzin, that has claws on its wings, and several do. That doesn't indicate that this is primitive, especially in the juvenile form, and all of the specimens of Archaeopteryx that we have are juvenile forms. But the real killer argument was published in Nature several years ago, back in '86. Evolutionary hypothesis is shaken by this fossil bird, 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx, advanced avian features. This is a good bird, half again as old as Archaeopteryx, but Archaeopteryx is supposed to lead the birds, but the birds got there first. That just really messes up the picture, and that's what we see over and over again in the evolutionary story. Science News tells us about the origin of dinosaurs. How did they get here? We're talking about transitions. What led to the dinosaurs? Now, this is up to date, April 16th. First, there were no dinosaur tracks, then there were many. This marks the moment of their explosion. Now, Don Patton didn't write this. This is the evolutionist that's writing. It's amazing how clear-cut the change was from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was. Boom. This is what you see all the way through the fossil record. That's not a picture of transitions. In fact, Stephen Stanley, I think, says it very honestly. From Johns Hopkins, he says, in fact, the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transition from one species to another. Now, men of great faith who believe everything came here by evolution would say they're all transitional forms. Not because they can see something transitioning, but because they have faith in evolution. But the actual documentation, most would say, well, yeah, we can find a few, like Archaeopteryx, but not a one, according to Stanley. Gould made some very important conclusions in his the final tome that he wrote just before he died. It's a huge, 1,200, 1,300 page book that is his final interpretation of evolution, trying to incorporate what he finds in the fossil record. But he makes some very significant revelations. He talks a lot about stasis, which is the opposite of evolution. So that we understand what he's talking about, notice Wikipedia's definition. Little or no evolutionary change in a species. That's what stasis is. The opposite of evolution. It stays the same, status quo. Now, rather complex statement, so put your thinking cap on to follow here, but there's some heavy thoughts in what he says. He's been accused when he makes the statement that stasis is what is the primary order that he sees in the fossil record, in spite of the fact that he's a devout evolutionist and atheist. And they object, well, you say that because of a lack of evidence. And they're saying, well, a lack of evolutionary evidence, and that may be partly true. But it's not a lack of evidence. He's responding to that. Sample of species at a large number of horizons, spread well over millions of years, which of course he devoutly believes in, you take your sample from one end to the other of the geologic scale. If these samples record no net change with beginning and end points substantially the same, then a conclusion of stasis rests on the presence of data, not the absence. In other words, this is data, the fact that over this wide range there's no change, beginning to end, it's the same. That's evidence. And he points out, the evolutionist says, no, that's not evidence, because he's looking at evidence of change and he doesn't see it. No, this is evidence. It's evidence of stasis. He says stasis existed in overwhelming abundance, as every paleontologist always knew. It's not a secret to them. It is the most common pattern in the fossil record. It is the primary signal of the fossil record. And then he says Darwin's expectations defined evolution as gradual change. In this context, stasis can only record sorrow and disappointment. That sounds like something I'd write. And it would be disappointing if I were an evolutionist trying to find evolution. It is an empirical signal of quite stunning contrariness, empirical falsification. Now, it's hard to find words that would more emphatically say the fossil record contradicts evolution. That's what he says. Stunning contrariness, empirical falsification is what you see with the fossil record. Well, of course, he died a number of years ago, not that long, but he's gone, and taking his place probably as the leader in the field would be Donald Prothero. He's written 5 geology textbooks, and if you got a new one, his is probably the one that's being used. He says many paleontologists came forward and pointed out that the geological literature was one vast monument to stasis, with relatively few cases where anyone had observed gradual evolution. This wasn't just Gould. This was many paleontologists that said that. He refers to Gould. As Gould put it, it was the dirty secret hidden in the paleontological closet. Now, this is what they were saying. Paleontologists all over the world saw that stasis was the general pattern and that gradualism was rare. And that is still the consensus 40 years later. Now, when Gould first said it, it was 40 years ago. He continued to say it long after that. But that's the consensus now, and this was written in 2015. That's the consensus. Stasis, the opposite of evolution, is the general pattern. Now, when we evaluate the two models in terms of creation and evolution, we see stasis, the monument to stasis, it's the most common pattern, the primary signal, the consensus. On the other hand, transitions, well, a few, but some would say not one. You got to have transitions to say evolution, but what you got is stasis. Now, which one is serving the model best? Does this favor creation or evolution, or is that even a question? But in spite of this, documented and acknowledged, they still believe because the alternative is God. A.C. Stewart, Cambridge, is talking about his field in biology, but it applies to other fields as well. He says the theoretically primitive type eludes our grasp. He's talking here about the orchid. Boom, there it is. Just like the dinosaurs. Boom, there they are. Our faith postulates its existence, that is the primitive type. It had to be something primitive leading to it. We believe that, but the existence fails to materialize. We can't find it. But they believe it, in spite of what they're seeing. Someone said the faith of the evolutionist involves the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. But it's not like our faith, which we can defend with evidence. It is a blind faith in spite of the evidence. And that's not honorable, noble. It's not a matter of integrity. When you follow the facts, looking at the evidence, even the evidence as defined by the evolutionist, you see that it was Darwin's biggest problem then, it's worse now. The stories that were told have been debunked. They're embarrassed. It's a headache. It brings sorrow and disappointment, empirical falsification. But they have blind faith. Now, that's the evidence on one side, according to the evolutionist. On the other side, according to the evolutionist, they're delighted. That is, it fits their predictions. It was an explosion just planted out of a magic box. It's the consensus, a monument to stasis. Using their description, which model is getting along better here? Or can you even really honestly ask the question? Recalling, Stanley says, without the fossils, evolution is just an outrageous hypothesis. This is the evidence. Without it, they got nothing. Well, I think they're without it. And I think we can demonstrate it from their own mouth. So that I believe, not just on what the Bible says, but by the empirical evidence that the fossil record definitely favors our view. That we're looking at the beginning of a fossil, of a flood deposit, and that's what we see suddenly and catastrophically preserved in the fossil record. Now, let's move to the second stanza of this song. And it's the same song, it's just the second verse. And the same story is seen when we look at fossil men. And yet when we talk to people about maybe they've lost their faith, they now believe in evolution. Why? Well, fossil men usually is given as the reason as often as any. Well, let's begin with a statement by Roger Lewin, who is editor of Research, News, and Science, the friend of Louis Leakey that we quoted earlier. His book, Bones of Contention, is talking about fossil men, and it's a pretty good history of the search for fossil men. Of course, he believes in the billions of years and devout believer in evolution. But he acknowledges the key issue, and I'd just underscore that. This is the key issue in paleoanthropology, studying fossil men. Here's the key issue: the ability to correctly infer a genetic relationship between two species on the basis of similarity in appearance. Now that's the ball game. That's how they do it. And then he goes on to acknowledge this is deceptive, partly because similarity of structure does not necessarily imply identical genetic heritage. A shark, which is a fish, a porpoise, which is a mammal, looks similar. Yep, that can be deceptive. And then there are a lot of other reasons that we showed you why that is often deceptive. But that's the ball game. How do you know that you can line these things up and show evolution? Well, this one kind of looks similar. And somebody disagrees. No, this one is more similar. And it's that similarity, which we know is deceptive, according to the leading evolutionist even, that is the fundamental basis of paleoanthropology. Richard Lewontin of Harvard makes another very important observation. And I want to be fair, he was caught in a weak moment here, being interviewed by Harper's. They had just won a court case, and so he's being generous somewhat. And for this to be a fair representation of him, you have to really underscore the word no. And I think you'll see what I mean. We don't know, really, really know anything about the ancestors of the human species. Well, he thinks he knows. But no, in terms of proving, we don't. All the fossils which have been dug up and are claimed to be ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they're ancestors. Now, yes, he certainly has the faintest idea. He has a deep conviction. But as far as knowing, you don't know. You can't know. It's up to you to draw the lines, because there are no lines. You don't dig up the bones and say, this is kin to Australopithecus. It doesn't have that stamped on it. There are no lines, but they draw the lines, and in the textbook you can see this kind of a representation. Australopithecus leading to Homo erectus to Neanderthal to modern. So let's look at that as an outline. Australopithecus, the most famous was Lucy, discovered by Donald Johanson. And I'm going to let you listen to a leading expert, David Minton. And he's the exception to what we talked about in the beginning. He's very obviously a creationist, a great scientist, was professor of anatomy at Washington University for 30 years. If you pick up a medical textbook, you'll find articles by him, probably a dozen of them in any medical dictionary. But he's talking about Australopithecus and the hip bone and some of the anatomy that is related here. Listen to him.
So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now, what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Latoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it, you'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect. You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious. So,
It's interesting that since then, 12 more specimens of Australopithecus have been found, and all 12 of them needed hip surgery. Arlene Zillman, University of California, Santa Clara, I think has a much more objective view. She compares and sees exactly the same thing in the pygmy chimp. Reported here in Science News, she compares the pygmy chimpanzee to Lucy, one of the oldest hominid fossils known and finds the similarities striking, almost identical in body size, stature, brain size. These commonalities, Zillman argues, indicate pygmy chimps use their limbs in much the same way Lucy did, more like a knuckle walker, sometimes upright. And sometimes apes can do that and do. It was an interesting article from Israel not long ago. The macaque monkeys got sick, got the flu. Some of them died. Some of them barely did recover. This one, after it did, was walking upright exclusively. The workers at the zoo say that's when she started walking upright exclusively. The zoo veterinarian says she's not sure why she's altered her behavior, speculating the illness could have caused brain damage. So maybe that's why we walk upright. Why do animals walk up? Some do, and some do it very well, like the rodents, and some of the chickens do a great job, do even coordinated dancing sometimes. The spiny anteater walks upright, and the lizard often walks upright. One of them walks upright so well it can run across the water. Another one it does such a good job it can sell insurance. But he doesn't get to be in the lineage that leads to man, because that's not the story. In spite of the fact that you see Australopithecus walking like an ape, this is a part of the lineage. He had a brain the size of an ape, teeth the size of an ape, and all of these points are documented in the handout, which we're just skimming over. Arms much longer than the legs, hands wrapping around the branches, legs like an ape, feet like an ape, and toes like an ape, as we indicated in the illustration not long, just a few slides back. What do you think that was? Must have been a duck. No, I think we're looking at the first rung of the ladder, obviously an ape. We move there from Homo erectus, and we just don't have time to go into detail here. I'd refer you to the handout. But notice the picture here of those who are examining the Piltdown skull at Cambridge, which was in the textbooks for over 40 years, a fraud, obvious fraud that was ultimately exposed. In Roger Lewin's book, he says, how is it that trained men, the greatest experts of their time, their day, could look at a set of modern human bones, and that is what they were looking at, part of it, the cranial fragments, and see a clear simian signature in it. Now, it wasn't there, but they saw it. And see in an ape's jaw, and that it was an ape's jaw, the unmistakable sign of humanity, which wasn't there. The answers inevitably have to do with the scientists' expectations and their effects on the interpretation of the data. In other words, if I hadn't have believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. And they saw it because of that conviction, in spite of the fact it wasn't there. That colors experts looking at the evidence often. Homo erectus involves Java man, which is described by Wolperth as a form of Homo sapien. Turkana boy we looked at earlier, about a foot taller than the boys that we have today. 1470 skull, Mary Leakey says modern, like modern humans. The Totally footprints, people not unlike ourselves, according to Mary Leakey, and Canopy man, according to Charles Oxnard, who's dean of the graduate school at USC, indistinguishable from modern, and that's with very complex comparison techniques with a computer. And that's 4.4 million years old, supposedly older than any of the things that's supposed to have led to man, and it's indistinguishable. I don't think that helps them. I think these are men. And then quickly to Neanderthal. If you meet that fella in a back alley, you know you got something different here. It's a ridiculous restoration. The ankle bones are on backwards. By Howells of Harvard said, by all laws of physics, he should have fallen on his face, trying to make it look like an ape man. This is Buell looked at Darwin's book and said, we got to find an ape man. Now, the leading authority in the world right now probably is Trinicus. In fact, he's described here as the world's most influential scholar of Neanderthal biology and evolution. He is a devout evolutionist, but he knows more about Neanderthals probably than anyone. Live Science quoted him this way. He says he has not seen evidence of any kind of difference, either biological or social, between humans and Neanderthals. Biological, social, it's us. And then in New Scientist here, 2014, enough of the cheap jibes, Neanderthal may have been just as clever as modern humans. And some of the studies of the Neanderthal DNA show that we overlap about 35 to 70%. So somewhere between 35 and 70% Neanderthal. Some might be insulted by that, but that's the results of the data. In Science News this year, we're told they have an unwarranted, brutish, and uncaring image, and this is the picture that goes with that point, together with this picture, which says they were compassionate, they were knowledgeable in response to injury and illness, challenging our notion that they were brutish. And then Science revealed earlier this year, now they're seafaring. They got in boats, and we know that they traveled from one place to another. There's not the image of Neanderthal that we normally have. When you see the one doing the restoring is the one that leaves the impression. We look at this fellow who was a wrestler in the Olympics recently. He was with the Russians, but we won't make any comments about his similarity to, because he was Russian. But here he is with that shape, and boy, it just fits really well. And we have learned a little bit from the DNA about what they look like, and it's not quite as pictured. The image of Neanderthals may be in need of a makeover. Scientists say at least some of these extinct hominids could have had fair skin and red hair. I got some red hair out here. You didn't know that was Neanderthal hair, did you? Well, it depends on whether or not the one doing the restoring has prejudice or not. There are some that get dressed up and have nice hair and fair skin that have their skeletal configuration so similar, it's striking. Watch as we compare with Julianne Moore. I mean, it fits perfectly. Yep, fair skin and red hair. But when National Geographic does that, they pick someone that has a dirty face and messed up hair. And yeah, okay, maybe fair skin, red hair, but Julianne Moore looks better to me. And we do know they used makeup. First, secure evidence, we're told, that they used cosmetics. And the author here from Bristol University says, it's the smoking gun that kills the argument once and for all. Bury this view that Neanderthals are half-wits. They dressed up and looked pretty and had jewelry. Summarizing, and the full quotes you'll see in the handout, unquestionably Homo sapien, according to Leakey. Ridiculous reconstruction, could not even stand up if the rest, according to the way it was ridiculously restored. The moderns, by the way, in Mount Carmel were found lower, Neanderthals on top of the modern on Mount Carmel. Human language, brain was larger. Did you know that? Pea brains. Neanderthal was bigger. It's about 1,600 cc's. Ours average is closer to 1,200, about 1,260 average. That used to mean something until we learned Neanderthal had a bigger brain, so it doesn't mean anything anymore. The proteins are exactly the same, and we've been able to sequence the proteins. Overlapping DNA, as we've shown. They were religious, buried their dead with religious ceremony and flowers. They were musical. They had the same do-re-mi scale that we have and the flutes that they made. And they used the cosmetics, and they were somewhat medical. According to the article last year, they used aspirin and penicillin, and they are seafaring. How primitive does that look to you? Maybe people right after the flood, some of them lived in caves. We got people live in caves today, but they were advanced people. So when we see men, apes, the next on the line is the modern men, where's the evolution? I think we can appreciate the comment made just recently by Bernard Wood, who's professor of human origins, George Washington University, in his book, Human Evolution, 50 years after Homo habilis, even with all the fossil evidence from the past 50 years, this is bringing it up to date, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains elusive. Homo is us. We don't have evidence. I think we can summarize the picture this way. You go to the ape barn in the zoo, and you see a wide variety of apes. They're all apes, but they're different. There used to be more, and they have become extinct over time, and we may have half as many. We may have 60%, 70%, but we've got less than we had. Well, if you know that we evolved from the apes, then one of those that went extinct, and that's a good place to look for an ancestor, and you make him fit. It has to be there. You know we came from the apes, and so you make it fit, and that's what we see happening. On the other hand, we see a variety of humans, and you look at that, and you may get the idea that's primitive looking. He's an Australian Aboriginal. This is Dr. Goolagong. He has a doctorate from Oxford. And there's a variety of people all around the world that are good people. Some of them look a little strange to our thinking, but they are good people, just like a variety of apes. What you find in between is the foolishness where they try to connect it, but I see apes and I see men, and that's what we see in the fossil record. And as Dwayne Gish says, when you try to put something in between, you take a little incus opus and a little hocus pocus, and you come up with Pithecus spoofus. I think the obvious record of fossil men favors creation, just as is the case with the fossil record itself, from beginning to end, including fossil man, is positive evidence for creation. All right, let's conclude and see if some of you have some questions. Everybody understood it all. Who has a question? Yes, sir.
When talking to somebody who believes in evolution, what would you say is a good starting point for having a discussion with them, or what would you go back to as kind of your bread and butter for starting a discussion?
I would encourage why questions. Why do you believe in evolution? And then you'll know where to go. He may talk about fossil man, or he may talk about something totally different, but you need to know where he's coming from. So I'd start with a why question and then take the clues from what he has to say. We do have, and you'll have here online these lectures, and that hopefully will be useful. If he has questions on fossil men, you could refer him to this lecture. There's a lecture online at Bible.ca that is just fossil men. It's an hour just on fossil men. We did, 15 minutes on it or less tonight, just covering the high spots. So there's a lot of good evidence available. But everybody's different, and you don't assume they're all in one spot. They're all over the place. And it may be they have no reasonable evidence in their mind at all, but they don't want to be governed by what the Bible says. And that's often the case. Yes.
When do evolutionists think that evolution actually stopped, or do they think it's still going?
Where do they think it stops? Where do they think it's going? Oh, they think it will continue, and Homo sapien will become super sapien, and we'll grow bigger brains and be Superman. And it's just dreaming. It has nothing to do with evidence. That's just philosophy. What we see in the real world is just what we often show when we talk about thermodynamics. Everything in this world is going downhill. And people see it going uphill, but it's going downhill. And we need to open our eyes and look at it. Other questions? Let me ask a question, and just take a minute. How many know what the title of Darwin's book was? What? Not exactly. Close. Origin of the Species by Natural Selection and Preservation of Favored Races, which would not fly today, but that was the original edition, the first two editions. Charles Darwin was one of the most rabid racists ever. Certainly would not fit in today's society. Writing one of his letters to William Graham, looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. You lower races, look out. You'll be eliminated by the higher, according to the evolutionist. Gould of Harvard acknowledges that arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Now, Gould was not an evolutionist. Was not a racist. He was a devout evolutionist. But because he was an evolutionist, why not be a racist? Maybe this race has evolved a little more than others. What's the problem here? This is what's happening. Creationists ought to know better. He says the pervasive racism of white scientists, they look to the activities of their own children for comparison with normal adult behaviors in lower races. Now, he's not saying they were lower, but he's saying the pervasive racism of white scientists did that. And then he illustrates with just some of the most disgusting pictures that passed as science in the early 1900s. This is from Popular Science Monthly. And Haeckel, who was one of the major proponents of Darwinism, drew pictures like this that just hopefully make your stomach turn. If it doesn't, there's something wrong with your stomach. This is the product of evolution. This is reasonable for an evolutionist. They may not follow the reason, but I can understand how the reason would lead there. What we're learning, of course, in biology is that, especially with the National Genome Project, there's no basis for race when we look at the genome. Here from the San Diego Tribune, the Union Tribune, no trace of race. Genome Project proves nothing biological separates the peoples. And Scientific American, does race exist? Their conclusion was no. You see differences, you see brown eyes, you see blue eyes, but that means what? Well, maybe prejudice ascribes something to it, or maybe it doesn't. Extra mental coloring in your skin. We all have the same color. We just got more of the chemical that makes it darker and lighter. What does that mean? Well, some people ascribe things to it, but if you're a creationist, you ought not to. Genesis 3 says Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. And so if we've got the same mother, doesn't that make us all brothers? Acts 17, he made from one man every nation of mankind. Who was the one man? We got the same father, we got the same mother. And I talked to some of my friends with darker skin who talk about the brothers, and I want to know why they're leaving me out. Now, there are Christians who are racist, but they ought not to be. And there are evolutionists who are not racist, but they really ought to be. I mean, not ought in a moral sense, but from the implications of their position. I think we need to put the race on their shoulders, the racism. That's where it belongs. And Christians ought to know better and ought to lead the way. Now, that's my question and answer. Anyone else have one? We thank you very much for your attention, and hope you can be with us tomorrow night when we talk about the ark.